Hey there everyone, Ramesh here, back again with another video. In this video, we'll take a look into top 10 Spring MVC interview questions and answers. Well, here in this blog post, I have listed top 10 Spring MVC interview questions and answers, guys. And these are the frequently asked Spring MVC questions. So whenever you prepare for the Java interview, make sure that you will check out these frequently asked questions on Spring MVC. All right, so here you can see right here the first question is, what is Spring MVC? Well, if you have already worked on Spring framework, then you might know that Spring framework has lots of modules. For example, Spring MVC, Spring Webflow, Spring Security, Spring Batch, Spring Data, Spring Social, all right, etc, etc. So all of these modules have their own purpose, and Spring MVC is one of the popular module in Spring framework, which is used to develop web applications as well as RESTful web services. Okay, so Spring MVC is a popular Java web MVC framework for building web applications as well as RESTful web services. And here you can see the term MVC. So this term signifies that Spring MVC follows model view controller design pattern, right? And whatever the core feature that Spring framework provides, like dependency injection and inversion of control, so all these features Spring MVC leverages. All right, so you can just give answer like Spring MVC is one of the popular Java web MVC framework for building web applications as well as RESTful web services, and Spring MVC is for basically follows model view control design pattern, and Spring MVC implements all the core feature that Spring framework provides, like dependency injection, inversion of control, etc. All right, so you just specify a few important points about Spring MVC. All right, great. So let's head over to the next question. Next question is, why should we use Spring MVC? This question may be asked in different way, like what are the advantages of using Spring MVC, or what is the benefit of using Spring MVC, right? So you have to mention 2 or 3 important points, like Spring MVC implements a clear separation of concerns that allows us to develop and unit test our applications easily. Well, here the term clear separation of concerns. Well, Spring MVC has a lot of components like dispatcher servlet, controllers, view resolvers, model, view, okay, and session attributes. So all these Spring MVC components are completely independent each other, and they are responsible for one thing only, right? So as all these components are independent, so unit testing is very easy, right? So whenever the components are independent, then unit testing is really makes easy. So that's why you have to mention the term clear separation of concerns, right? Because all the components in Spring MVC are independent each other, and they do their own responsibility. And next thing is, we aren't tied with specific view technology, but we have option to choose from others we like the most. Well, we use a view technology, right, to develop the view layer in Spring MVC applications like GSP, TimeLib, etc. So Spring MVC provides an option to choose the view layer, I mean the view technology. We don't have to use only one view technology like JSP. Spring MVC basically provides different options to use view technology. We can use JSP or TimeLib or FreeMarker or Mustache, etc. Right? This is awesome, right? We don't have to tie only with a single view technology. All right, Spring MVC provides a different option to choose whatever the view technology that we like the most, isn't it? So just mention this one important point. Next is, we don't use Spring MVC only in web applications development, but we also use Spring MVC in the creation of RESTful web services as well. All right, so these are the few important points why should we use Spring MVC. Well, let's take a look into the next question. Next question is, how does Spring MVC works internally, or explain Spring MVC request flow. Well, this is one of the commonly asked interview question on Spring MVC, guys. So you have to prepare an answer for this question. All right, so here you can see the diagram. So you can just remember this diagram. This diagram shows how the HTTP request is processed from start to end in Spring MVC framework. Well, you can see the steps, step 1 to up to 10. All right, so whenever you will answer this question, make sure that you will explain step by step, right? And here you can see the core components of Spring MVC framework like dispatcher servlet, handler mapper, controller, view solver, view, etc. And dispatcher servlet is the main core or heart of the Spring MVC. Dispatcher servlet basically is also called a front controller, right? Because dispatcher servlet sits at the front, and whatever request comes from the browser, it will process the request first. All right, so let's go and let's see the step by step. So first step is whenever we hit a URL in the browser, that request first come to the dispatcher servlet. And in a second step, dispatcher servlet will basically consult handler mapper to just identify which controller is responsible to handle the request. So once handler mapper identify the controller, then it will send all those controller details back to the dispatcher servlet. So this is third step. And then once dispatcher servlet will get all the controller details, then dispatcher servlet will pass that request details, I mean the HTTP request, to the controller. Then controller will basically process the request, and it will validate the request, and then it will create the model and view, and then that model and view will be sent back to the dispatcher servlet, right? So this is the fifth step. And then dispatcher servlet, what it will do, it will then again consult a view resolver to identify the physical location of the view. View here is meaning that the JSP or thymely page name. Okay, so once view resolver will get the view and model details from the dispatcher servlet, it will find out the physical location of the view. Okay, and then that details will be sent again back to the dispatcher servlet. So once dispatcher servlet will get the view location and the model data, then it will send to the view component. View component will basically merge the view and model data, and it will produces the HTTP page, I mean the web page, and that web page again sent back to the dispatcher servlet. Now dispatcher servlet once get the HTTP web page, that web page will be sent back to the browser for rendering. Alright, so these are the 10 steps involved in how Spring MVC works internally. Right, so try to explain all these steps briefly. And here I have given all these steps nicely, so you can go ahead and read out these steps and try to compare these steps with a diagram so that you can remember these steps easily. Okay, so great. Next question is, what is the difference between controller and REST controller? Well, as I mentioned, we can use Spring MVC to develop web applications as well as RESTful web services, right? So interviewer will basically ask this question to just check your knowledge, like what are the annotations that you can use to develop the web application and RESTful web services, right? So the main difference between controller and REST controller annotation is that response body annotation is automatically included in the REST controller. Well, let's take a look into the first example, and then we'll come back to the definition. So here in the example, we have an employee controller. This employee controller class is annotated with add_controller annotation, and this basically a REST API. So this employee controller has crude REST APIs for employee resource. And whenever we develop REST APIs using Spring MVC, we add @RestController annotation on top of class, and then we use @responseBody annotation in the handler method, isn't it? In the return type of the handler method. So this is how we basically develop the REST APIs using Spring MVC. And if you can notice here we are using @controller and @responseBody annotation, and here we are using @responseBody annotation with all the handler methods. So look at here, this controller class has 5 methods, and all these 5 methods has @responseBody annotation in the return type of the method, right? So instead of repeating this annotation for all these handler methods, why not we can include this annotation in @controller itself, right? So that is where the REST controller annotation comes in. So REST controller is basically the combination of @controller and @responseBody annotation. So whenever we develop the REST APIs using Spring MVC, we can just use @RestController annotation. We don't have to use these both annotations. Okay, so you can see the next example here. So in this example, we have removed add response body annotation from all the method handlers, and we have just used add rest controller annotation. All right, so add rest controller annotation is just the combination of add controller and add response body annotation. Okay, so let's get back to the definition over here. The main difference between add controller and add rest controller annotation is that the add response body annotation is automatically included in add rest controller. This means that we don't need to annotate our handler methods with add response body annotation again, right? Alright, I hope you got the idea. Just remember, add rest controller annotation is the combination of add controller annotation and add response body annotation. Alright, so add rest controller is the combination of add controller annotation and add response body annotations. Let's head over to the next question. What are the add request body and add response body annotations? Well, request body annotation is used as a handler method parameter, and it binds the HTTP request body to the transfer or domain object. And Spring framework basically automatically deserialize the incoming HTTP request to the Java object using HTTP message converters. For example, let's say we send a request, that is HTTP post request, with this JSON request body. And let's say we have an employee model in our Spring MVC. And whenever we want to convert this JSON into Java object directly, then we can use add request body annotation in the method handler of Spring MVC. So you can see here we are using add request body annotation to just convert the HTTP request body, that is JSON, into directly a employee Java class. And Spring internally uses HTTP message converters to do this job. We don't have to manually convert JSON or any message media type into Java object. Spring framework will deserialize automatically the incoming HTTP request to Java object using HTTP message converters, right? So this is about add request body annotation. Just try to explain with examples, okay? And response body annotation on the handler method in Spring MVC controller, it indicates that we will write the return type of the method directly to HTTP response body. Well, in Spring MVC web applications, the handler method basically returns the view, right? View meaning JSP or Thymeleaf or other view technologies. But in case of Spring MVC REST APIs, the handler method should write the JSON or XML or any the type that we specify to the HTTP response body. It shouldn't return any view, isn't it? So whenever your handler method in a Spring MVC controller want to return a JSON or XML or any different media type that supports to the to the client, then you have to use add response body annotation, right? So look at here the example. So this handler method returns the list of employees, and when we use add response body annotation, so it internally converts this Java list of employee Java objects into array of JSON objects using HTTP message converters. So next question is how to handle exceptions in Spring MVC applications. Well, if you have already worked on Spring MVC, then you might know that how to handle exception in Spring MVC. So try to explain briefly, and here I have mentioned 3 options for handling exceptions in Spring MVC applications. So first is using HTTP status code. So it's pretty straightforward. So you can just create a custom exception which extends a runtime exception and annotate add response status annotation on top of this class, and just specify whatever the status code that you want to return to the client, and just throw this exception from the handler method in Spring MVC controller. For example, look at here. Alright, so whenever handler method throws this exception, then if this exception is not handled in your application, then directly this exception can be returned to the client with status code not found. Okay, it's straightforward. Next is controller based exception handling. Well, this way you can handle exceptions by using add exception handler annotation. Well, let's say I have a controller, Spring MVC controller, and I have few handler methods, and whatever the exceptions thrown by method handlers, that I want to handle with that specific controller only. In that case, you can use at exception handler annotation. For instance, let's say in our Spring MVC controller, few handler methods returns a response not found exception. Then what we can do is we can create a method like this, and we can annotate this method with at exception handler, and we need to specify the exception that we want to handle, and this method basically prefer the error message, and then it will return back to the client. Alright, so this is control base exception handling. I mean controller specific, we can handle the exception by using add exception handler annotation, right? And next is global exception handler. So if you want to handle exception throughout the application, I mean if you handle the exception in a central place or in a single place in the application, then you can use global exception handling method. So in this case, what you need to do is you need to create a class, you need to annotate that class with add controller advice annotation, and you can specify all the all the methods that handle the exception by using add exception handler annotation. So instead of handling exception in each controller, what you can do is you can create a separate class like this. You can annotate this class with add controller advice annotation, and you can create this kind of methods and just annotate it with add exception handler annotation, and just pass the exception that you want to handle. Alright, so try to briefly explain how you can you have handled exceptions in your Spring MVC applications. Well, the next question is, what are the annotations you used in your Spring MVC applications? Well, this kind of question you typically get, right? So interviewer would just want to check your knowledge on the annotations. Okay, so try to explain the important annotations. Well, here I have noted down all the annotations that we can use in our Spring MVC applications. So here you can see add controller annotation, request body, request mapping, get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, patch mapping, controller advice, response body exception handler, response status, path variable, request param, rest controller, model attribute, cross origin, init binder. So these are the very important Spring MVC annotations. So just remember and try to provide as much as annotations that you know. Well, the next question is, what is the use of @AutoAdd annotation? Well, @AutoAdd annotation is very important, guys. So we can use @AutoAdd annotation to mark a dependency which Spring is going to resolve and inject, and we can use @AutoAdd annotation with constructor, setter, and field injection. Well, whenever we want to use Spring Bean, then we can use @AutoAdd annotation to inject that bean, and we can use in our Spring MVC components, right? And there are three ways we can inject the dependencies by using @AutoAdd annotation. First is constructor based injection. So here we simply create a constructor of the class, and we can use @AutoAdd annotation to inject the dependency. The dependency here, customer service. And setter injection, basically we create a setter method, and then we inject customer service by using @AutoAdd annotation. And here again, the field based injection, we create a field like private customer service, and then we just inject it by using @AutoAdd annotations. Pretty straightforward. Next question is, what is the use of @ModelAttribute annotation? So probably you have used this annotation, right? So this annotation is one of the important annotations in Spring MVC. It binds a method parameter or a method return value to the named model attribute and then expose it to the view directly. Well, here you can see the two types we can use @ModelAttribute annotation. Like we can use @ModelAttribute annotation at a method level or method argument. So here you can see the example. So we can just create a method, we can annotate that method with @ModelAttribute, and we can just add the data to the model, and this model data will be directly available to the view layer. And in case of method argument, so whenever we submit the form and we want to directly map that form data to the Java Bean class, then that case we can use ModelAttribute here. And this is the employee object, it contains the form data, and this form data will be directly bind to the employee bean by using @ModelAttribute annotation, right? So this is one of the very important annotation we can say in the Spring MVC annotations. Alright, the next question is explain add path variable and request param annotations. Well, if you have already worked on building REST APIs using Spring MVC, then you have used these two annotations a lot, right? So we use add path variable annotation to bind a request URL template path variable to the method variable. For example, look at here, this is the URL and this URL contains two path variables 100 and Ramesh, and whenever we develop the REST API we need to bind these path variables to our Java method arguments, right? In that case we can use add path variable annotation. For example, look at here, this is the method handler, and in the URL if we want to bind the value 100 to some URL path variable, then we can specify within a curly braces like this. So here 100 is bind to this URL template path variable, and Ramesh is bind to this name URL template path variable. Now this value we need to get in some method argument, right? Method argument in the case some Java variable. Here Java variable is id of type long, and here is Java variable name is the type of string. So we can use add path variable annotation to bind a value of URL template path variable to the method argument, that is id. Then we can use add path variable annotation. So similarly, if you want to bind the name value of name URL template path variable to name Java variable, then we can use add path variable annotation. That's pretty simple. Similarly, request param annotation we can use to just extract the values from the query string. So whenever URL like this, here you can see question mark id equal to 100 and name equal to Ramesh. So this is the query parameters, right? So whenever the URL contains a query parameters, and if we want to extract value from the query parameters in the URL, then we can use add request param annotation. So look at here, we are using add request param annotation to bind the query parameter values to the method argument id and name. Alright, it's pretty simple, guys. So these are the 10 frequently asked question on Spring MVC, and yeah, so whenever you prepare for the interview for Java or Spring, then try to go through these few frequently asked questions on Spring MVC. Alright guys, I hope you at least got an idea which kind of questions you will get in a Spring MVC or Spring interviews or Java interviews. Alright guys, let me know if you have any questions on this topic. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.